Hello, YouTube, and welcome back to another book review from me, your host, Logan Albright. Today I'm talking about the book Three Hearts and Three Lions by Poul Anderson. At least I think it's pronounced Poul Anderson. It might be Poul or Powell. It's spelled a little unusually. It's apparently a Danish name, so I'm not sure. But I'm going to say Paul for the time being, and you can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. I discovered this book because I was researching why it is that dwarves have Scottish accents and why we always perceive dwarves in fantasy as Scottish. Doesn't really make a lot of sense. If you look at the source material, most like dwarven legends come from Scandinavia, not from Scotland. And then in the Lord of the Rings, where the dwarves were sort of in the Hobbit, where the dwarves were codified, there's nothing Scottish about them really particularly, except for that they like to drink beer, I suppose. But that's true of a lot of cultures all over the world. That's not a particularly Scottish thing. And then they have long beards as well. But it's Tolkien kind of modeled the dwarven civilization a little bit after the Hebrews. So it doesn't really make any sense. So I was researching this. I was like, where do we get this idea from? Where does this stereotype come from? And the answer is apparently this book, Three Hearts and Three Lions by Poul Anderson. It came out in 1961. It is a fantasy novel. The author was a Danish-American science fiction writer primarily, but also wrote a lot of fantasy, very celebrated, very prolific. I was actually not familiar with him at all before this book, so I was excited to check him out and learn about a new author. I also got another book of his called The Broken Sword, which I will be reviewing as soon as I read it. But for now, I want to talk about this one. The plot of Three Hearts and Three Lions is essentially that of a World War II soldier named Holger Karlsson, who is, for some reason, magically transported into a fantasy realm. It appears to be like medieval Europe, except for the fact that there are, witches and fairies and giants and ogres and all kinds of other types of fantasy creatures. And there's magic, and he is mystified and doesn't know why he's there. And there's a horse for him, and there's some armor for him, and a sword, and he gets dressed in the armor and gets on the horse and goes trying to figure out what's going on. And then the rest of the book is like a series of adventures that he has in this world where he's trying to work out what's going on and how to get back to his own world. Quite an interesting book. And one of the main characters is a dwarven character who he's not very similar to the Lord of the Rings dwarves at all. He's like a forest dweller, and he's smaller than the Lord of the Rings dwarves. He's described as about 3 feet tall, but he does have a long white beard, and he speaks with a very thick Scottish accent, which is written out in dialect by the author. He likes to write in dialect. I'm not generally a huge fan of people who write in dialect because I find it kind of difficult to read and distracting, but it can be fun, and it's fun in this case. Although he's not the only character who speaks with a Scottish accent, some of the other forest creatures do as well. But I imagine this is where the idea that dwarves speak with a Scottish accent comes from. It's also apparently very influential on Gary Gygax, the creator of Dungeons and Dragons. And he read this book, and he read The Lord of the Rings, and he created his fantasy races in Dungeons and Dragons, and I think he modeled the dwarves a lot after this archetype of the dwarf, this kind of model of the dwarf. And so that's where you get some of those characteristics from, and that's why we have these stereotypes about what dwarves are like in modern fantasy, which I found really interesting. I'm interested in the history of these kind of ideas. You get these kind of mimetic cultural notions that just show up and everybody knows them, but nobody knows where they came from, and no one knows why they know them or why they think this. And so I'm interested in kind of tracing the history of those things, and this is a great book to do that. It's pretty interesting. Now, the book borrows pretty heavily from The Hobbit, which I found interesting, as it was published after The Hobbit in 1961. I think The Hobbit is 1937 or something like that, late 1930s. And there's a lot of very close parallels. There's a fight with a giant which turns to stone in the sunlight, like the trolls do in The Hobbit, and there's a riddle competition like there is in The Hobbit, and there's just a lot of very kind of parallel ideas. But a lot of these ideas are drawn from traditional fairy tales and folklore as well. They're not exclusively from The Hobbit, but the way that it kind of plays out as a series of adventures that kind of mimics the adventures that Bilbo has in The Hobbit doesn't seem accidental to me. It seems like it was a deliberate kind of homage or lifting or copying, whatever you want to call it. But he obviously treats the material in a very different way. This book is a little bit more humorous, and it's a little bit more self-aware of the fantasy world, and it's the protagonist, Holger Carlson, is trying to constantly apply like 20th century scientific logic to all the things that he's encountering in the world, and uses that as sort of a way to get an advantage over the magical creatures. It's the fact that he knows about science. And it's also reminiscent of the Mark Twain novel, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, which has a similar conceit where a modern soldier is transported back into King Arthur's court and has all this knowledge of science that he can use to kind of help him get a one-up on the locals. Although that book has a very bleak ending, whereas this one is a lot more positive and happy. So it was a really fun, enjoyable fantasy adventure. I don't read a ton of fantasy because I feel like there's a problem with fantasy in that, like, fantasy and science fiction go hand in hand, right? They're next to each other. And I like the trappings of fantasy more than I like the trappings of science fiction. I'm more interested in elves and fairies and dwarves and giants and ogres and monsters and magic and witches than I am in spaceships and technology and aliens and interplanetary travel and things like that. I just like those things better. But science fiction as a genre is this like fertile playground for exploring really complex and interesting philosophical ideas about the nature of humanity, our place in the universe, the nature of technology, the nature of civilization. All these like really deep ideas are explored in all the best science fiction novels. I mean, there's obviously space opera novels that's just like, you know, shooting aliens in space. But the best science fiction novels are really rooted in kind of a deep, very thoughtful, very thought-provoking set of ideas. And that's what I love about science fiction. I feel like fantasy novels really lack that. Like, fantasy novels tend to just be sword and sorcery, go kill the bad guys, chop off the goblins' heads, rescue the damsel in distress, and that's it. And this book suffers a little bit from that. It's very episodic. Each chapter there's a challenge that the protagonist encounters, and then the protagonist beats the challenge, overcomes the challenge, and then moves on to the next chapter where the same thing happens. And I find that very repetitive, and I wish that there was more to sink your teeth into, so to speak. You know, like, I wish there was more depth of ideas in these stories rather than just go kill the bad guys and rescue the girl. Which is fun, and I enjoy that, but like it leaves a little bit to be desired, and it's not like you can read a million of those books and find them all satisfying, because they're all kind of the same. So I'm hoping that I can find some fantasy that really kind of blends these ideas, these deeper ideas about human nature and about the world that we live in, with these elements that I find so appealing, these kind of cosmetic elements of, you know, forests and nights and all those kind of things that I like. But I don't seem to find many of them, and I think that's why I don't gravitate towards fantasy as a genre as much as I gravitate towards science fiction. And you would think that the opportunity would be there, because the mythology and the folklore that all this stuff is drawn from stems from kind of our ancestors trying to understand the world that they lived in through myth. And you think that there'd be a lot of like room to explore human consciousness and our deepest fears and our deepest anxieties and our insecurities and all that kind of stuff that kind of brought about these legends in the first place. But I haven't seen many people do that, so I'm on the lookout for more. But I will read The Broken Sword next, and I will find out what I think of that. It's a little bit longer, and I think it's a little bit more serious. Oh, the other thing I had to say about this book is, speaking of Dungeons & Dragons, the alignment system for Dungeons & Dragons was also taken from Three Hearts and Three Lions. Yeah, I keep wanting to say crowns for some reason. 3 crowns and 3 lions, but that's not right. 3 Hearts and 3 Lions. The alignment system was largely derived from this book, because in the book there's a global war going on between the forces of chaos and the forces of law, and the humans are on the side of law and civilization and trying to bring order to the world, and like the fairy kingdom is all on the side of chaos and kind of this primordial, just everybody kind of anarchic primordial state of existence where there aren't any, you know, boundaries or rules or constructs, and they're portrayed as, you know, the bad guys, and the order law guys are the good guys. So that's where you get sort of the chaotic neutral, the lawful neutral, the chaotic good, lawful good alignment system from Dungeons and Dragons. I personally, when I play Dungeons and Dragons, which I have a few times in my life, I like to play chaotic, and I tend to be a little bit more drawn to the chaotic side of things, even though in this book they're portrayed as not being such good people all the time. The forces of law are held up to be the thing to aspire to, which I get, but come on, it's a little bit boring, isn't it? So anyway, I enjoyed Three Hearts and Three Lions a lot. It's not mind-blowing, but it was a good book, a great fantasy romp adventure, and I'm looking forward to reading The Broken Sword and seeing what I think of that too. And then maybe I'll check out some of the author's science fiction works and see if they're any different or what they're like. I haven't read anything else by him before, so I'll let you know. But that's my thoughts on Three Hearts and Three Lions. And I hope you've enjoyed them, and if so, please leave me a comment down below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications. You know all the stuff to do all the stuff. Before I go, and I hate to do this, but I have to do it every once in a while, my book, which I wrote, called Conform or Be Cast Out, The Literal Demonization of Nonconformists. It's still on sale at Amazon.com, and I only need to sell a handful more copies in order to hit a marketing goal that I'm meeting for, or a sales goal that I'm trying to meet for my publisher. So if you're interested, it's a book about how people who are different have been historically demonized, and not just demonized, but demonized in the most literal sense of the term, being compared to some sort of metaphysical evil like devil worshippers or Satanists or evil witches or sorcerers and things like that. And I kind of trace that history and talk about a lot of different examples of that throughout our modern times and ancient times as well. And the ideas of where this kind of necessity of demonizing people who are different comes from psychologically and historically. So if you're interested in that, please pick up a copy of my book, available in paperback and ebook. And I really would appreciate it. It'd be a huge help. But that's all I got for today. I'll be back again next week with another book review. Thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.